the fact that this has been taken out of this seminal study, which now lots of children are being chemically sterilised on the basis of this, absolutely criminal and requires prosecutions.
This is Callum Smiles for Rebel News here at John Smith Square in central London, and I'm joined by Connor Tomlinson of the Lotus Eaters to talk about Drag Queen Story Hour. So Connor, I tried to get in touch with Drag Queen Story Hour UK. There was a little bit of a back and forth until they found out who I am, then they stopped talking to me. So you are now my go-to expert. Connor, what can you tell me about Drag Queen Story Hour here in the UK and around the world?
So I've been appointed the archaeologist of degeneracy over at the Lotus Eaters. I do the muckraking so that nobody else has to. And I'm not shocked Drag Queen Story Hour UK didn't want to talk to you, because I don't know if you're familiar with the fellow who read to children at the Tate Modern. By the name of Sab Samuel. His drag queen name is Ada HD. And recently Redux published an expose where there was a drag queen found dead outside a Cardiff nightclub. And Sab Samuel crowdfunded for his funeral, saying rest in power. Now, this particular drag queen had been convicted of statutory rape of a boy quite a few years ago, and it was known within the community. So I would not trust someone, especially someone like that, who says that love has no age on their Twitter profile, to have the best intents for kids at heart. Lots of people are going to obviously say that Drag Queen Story Hour, there's no difference between it or being a pantomime dame. Now, this is a total misnomer, because nobody takes their kids to a panto and says that that man in the dress up there that we're all laughing at, because it's obviously absurd, is itself a woman. And so Drag Queen Story Hour is meant to be a pipeline towards queer and trans identities. And they say as much in a paper called Drag Pedagogy, written by a drag queen called Little Miss Hot Mess, because that's the standard of academia nowadays. It's in Taylor and Francis, by the way. Not exactly a very fringe journal. It's one of the mainstream education journals. And Little Miss Hot Mess campaigned to keep anyone who changes their gender or sexuality online, they don't have to verify their identity. Again, we're seeing a thread of not having to vet things here. And they wrote a book that's called The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, Swish, Swish. Unfortunately a bestseller, which has now been added to the New York School Board curriculum for 3 and up. And this person has said that Drag Queen Story Hour intends, and these are quotes, to disrupt the reproductive futurity of the nuclear family and open children up to a adopted drag family to give them the ability to don new costumes, do makeup and things like that. So Drag Queen Story Hour is deliberately trying to distance the children that are participating in it, not of their own volition, because it's being imposed on them in schools or by crazy mothers with obvious borderline personality disorder that try to drag their kids to this because they want to be seen as progressive or on the right side. These kids are being exposed to individuals who want to distance them from their parents, engender resentment, and create new sexuality identities that keep them unstable, in flux, and ultimately revolutionary. This is why they say in the opening of the paper, Drag Queen Story Hour is a way of bringing queer ways of knowing and being into early childhood education. And the last line is an explicit threat. There will be a trail of glitter that will never come out of the carpet. They are intentionally doing irreversible damage to these children's minds.
And when it comes to education, like, how long has all this been about in the UK and in the schooling system?
I think it's quite a few years, because we're uncovering lots of things. So, for example, there was a recent case where in the Isle of Man, a drag queen was brought in to tell children there were upwards of 70 genders. And when one child questioned it, he got sent out of the classroom. And there's loads of guidance from various councils. We exposed one recently on Lotus Eaters about Swindon Town Council's guidance that had children making genitals using household items, fruit and vegetable, and said you can make the prostate fluid out of hand lotion. Now, this was meant to be for primary school kids. You don't get that level of intellectual rot without a long march through the institutions. Fortunately, there is something being done about it now. Rishi Sunak, for all of its many, many globalist faults, has actually signed off on Backbencher Miriam Cates MP's inquiry into sex education in schools. And the unfortunate thing is there's no shortage of evidence. So she's constantly upturning brand new things. One of the things recently that I'm sure you reported on, the Daily Mail reported on, that my friend Dominique Samuel showed the videos of, was the Kebaba rave event, where this is a baby cabaret rave event where some man was on a sex swing descending from the ceiling and dancing around in bondage gear, and there were other drag queens, for example, at the Honour Oak pub that Calvin Robinson recently protested, where they were saying, oh, the drag queen didn't show up, it's totally fine. Now, this drag queen's name was Coppertop. Now, to put it in a PC term, this is a reference to an act involving fellatio and excrement, and this person was performing to children, and they hoisted up their skirt and did the splits with a thong on. The fact that we are inviting this into schools, publicly funded libraries, and any children are being invited to a pub in the daytime to see an adult performer put on a show, just disturbing.
So would you say that actually the education system is encouraging the sexualising of children and paedophilia?
I would say that they're definitely encouraging the sexualisation of children. I would say that, to not implicate myself in anything libelous, I would say that they are at least softening the boundaries of what constitutes consent for kids. And this is endorsed from totally the top down, by the way. I don't know if you're familiar with the UN 21 principles by UNAIDS. Clue is in the name, have put out 21 principles for the international governance of drug decriminalisation, abortion, trans-affirming healthcare, and sexual consent. And one of the principles did apply to say that children can consent to drug use and sex, and this is obviously downstream so one of the arguments in there was that because abortion should have absolutely no limits on it, mothers can take drugs while they're pregnant, and because children should at all times and all places have access to gender-affirming care, genital lobotomies, then they can consent to doing other things with their genitalia. And the disturbing thing about this is, okay, if the UN member states are not rescinding their funding over this, and part of the UN's 2030 agenda is the rollout of education as a human right across all forms of member states, what exactly constitutes education? And so, frankly, from the top, I can't speak about individual teachers, but it certainly seems like the UN and various people in the education sector are happy to suggest that children might be able to consent, and they might be using drag queens as ambassadors to spread that message.
We were discussing earlier about the whole idea of, they're teaching these things because of things like intolerance. And many people say that, the boomer generation are the most intolerant. So why are they going after the children instead of what they believe are the most intolerant people in society?
Yeah, you'd expect that they'd be reading to nursing homes, wouldn't you? And trying to wake everyone up to the joys of gender self-expression. But no, instead they're targeting the most susceptible and vulnerable to confusion. And I think it's a two-pronged approach. The first of all is, if you destabilise someone's identity, then you make them very reliant on whoever else is telling them what the new identity should be. So you're creating a revolutionary underclass who are miserable about themselves, who blame the whole world for telling them they've got to fit this specific box, and so you're creating a bunch of gender communists, essentially. They want to tear things down and will never be happy about the new image that they adopt. And then the second one is, if you can sexualise children from an early age and make it normal, then you can open the door to paedophilia. And I'm not going to name specific individuals that are currently pushing this in schools, of course, as paedophiles. But we do know that some drag queens have been convicted of that. We have Robert Clothier, who headlined Brighton Pride, who was caught in a police sting operation trying to meet two children with pink underwear from Primark and chocolate-flavoured condoms. Or in Houston, Texas, Alfonso Garza, who was allowed to participate in Drag Queen Story Hour despite being a convicted sex offender that they didn't vet. So we should be very, very careful about the people we are bringing around children in the misguided name of inclusion or tolerance.
What is your opinion as to why they are actually going for the children?
Because the children are the most pliable, and it is obvious that there are some people within the movement that are using the label of diversity and tolerance and acceptance, which is a cudgel which they can beat people that are possibly more liberal in temperament or don't want to be perceived as racist, sexist, homophobic, or whatever other ism, as a Trojan horse to get access to children, the most vulnerable in society, because there are obvious paedophiles in the movement, and that's not defamatory when we have people convicted of paedophilia dressing up as drag queens and trying to do this sort of thing.
Many people who are, you could say, indifferent on the idea, they're not very well researched on exactly what's going on. They will hear that one side says we're preaching tolerance, and then on your side, you're saying they're not. How could you separate the two? Because they're saying they're preaching tolerance. Why would you say they're not?
Because the outcome that Drag Queen Story Hour was trying to do is to not only normalise the sexualisation of children from a young age, but also to push trans identity as acceptable. And we can see this with rising rates of trans identity among my generation. Stonewall proudly put out that it's 1 in 4. The statistic the other day was 10% of kids want to change their gender while they're at school. And these surgeries, I mean, I've had friends who have desisted. I've talked to Richie Herron, who is currently suing the NHS for botched lower genital surgery that nearly made him bleed out. There are plenty of young women who have had their breasts removed after one consultation or have been given hormones which have sterilised them or given them bone cancer. I don't see how any of these treatments, unique to this mental disorder, by the way, because we don't give liposuction to anorexics to bring their body in line with their disordered mind. Any disorder that's treated like this, I don't see how pushing this is tolerant, fair, or safeguarding children.
So Connor, tell me about the very unknown Dutch protocol.
So the Dutch protocol is the foundation, the study, which has been the basis of why puberty blockers have been given to children, including things like Lupron, which was deemed inhumane to give to sex offenders. The Dutch protocol was funded by a pharmaceutical company that makes the drugs, by the way, so we can see clear vested interest in here, as we do with many transgender studies, because the convenient sampling, the people they go and talk to about their well-being after they've transitioned, has been corralled by many transgender NGOs. But the Dutch protocol specifically got gender dysphoric young people together, and they asked them, did puberty blockers suppress your puberty? And of course, they worked as intended. Since then, it's been interpreted as, did taking the puberty blockers depress your suicidality? And so it's been interpreted as a way of treating transgender rates of suicide in the young. And this is why you get the emotional blackmail of parents of, you can either have a trans kid or a dead kid. This is their argument. But the Dutch protocol never actually looked into suicidality. So it's a misnomer. And the worst part of it is, one of the participants died and they were struck from the records. The reason was, they took these puberty suppressant drugs. When they went to have sex change surgery at 18, there was not enough tissue downstairs to invert into a fake vagina, so they had to graft part of their colon tissue. They got fecal contamination and died of blood poisoning. And the fact that this has been taken out of this seminal study, which now lots of children are being chemically sterilised on the basis of this, absolutely criminal and requires prosecutions.
And finally, like, we see all these teachers on strike over pay and working conditions, but from what you know, what can you tell me about, the teachers' thoughts on this sort of education? Because I've not seen many teachers, if any, walk out in terms of what they're being told is now in the curriculum, such as comprehensive sexuality education, which is, the framework set by the World Health Organization. What can you tell me from what you've found about the teachers? Are they pro this, indifferent, or against?
I think there's a sort of conspiracy of silence, because there's a lot of things you can do as a teacher and in any government job to never get yourself thrown out, but transgressing against the progressive hegemony is definitely one of those. And I know for a fact that there are Catholic schools now who are appointing diversity, inclusion and equity coordinators, who are segregating assemblies by race, sex and gender. And there are perfectly well-meaning and upstanding people in there who do everything from teaching the core subjects to pastoral care, who have said, kids are being damaged by this, they're being very upset by it, they're being deliberately confused, and I as a teacher am being compelled to use the pronouns by the students. They, on an individual level, are doing, and I hate to use the word subversive by saying that they're just affirming the child's normal sex and gender identity, but they on an individual level are trying to persuade the children to not do this. But on the widespread scale, I mean, the Policy Exchange came out with that report recently where they said as many as 1 in 4 students are leaving school identifying as LGBTQ. There was the recent statistic where 10% at school want to change their gender, and upwards of 70% are attending schools that affirm trans identities. So there might be individual teachers interspersed here and there, but at the top, particularly with the new priestly class that's been installed by saying that diversity is a strength and that we must cut the breasts off 16-year-old girls to bring their bodies in line with their troubled mind, it's being reinforced. So none of the teachers that are striking are really talking about that, but they are complaining they're not getting enough money to do it.
Well, Connor, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Many mainstream media outlets aren't covering the degeneracy that is the sexualising of children, not just here in the UK, but in the entire Western world. So if you appreciate the fact that we are covering this serious, important subject, please head over to ukreporters.co.uk, share the content, and help crowdfunded journalism stay alive. Thank you.